They thought I'd crawl back, but when your parents lock the door and tell you you're on your own now on Christmas night, something inside you breaks differently. I slept in my car, holding the pocket watch my grandfather left me. The next day I took it to the bank, and when they opened his old vault, every lie my family told me came spilling out with the truth. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Snow was coming down so hard it looked like the whole street was dissolving into white. The houses along Queen Anne Avenue glowed warm behind frosted windows. Christmas lights blinking like tiny heartbeats. Inside those homes, people laughed and toasted over dinner. Inside mine, someone was yelling my name, Emily. For once in your life, listen. My father's voice cut through the clatter of silverware and the hum of Bing Crosby on the radio. He was standing at the end of the dining table, red-faced, veins raised in his neck. You've been out of work for months. You live here for free. You eat our food, and now you can't even do one small favor. Sign the damn loan so we can refinance the house. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the floor. I already told you, Dad. I'm not signing anything. I don't want to be dragged into another one of your business debts. His eyes flashed. Ungrateful doesn't even begin to cover it. Mom was standing behind him, her hands clasped like she was praying. Sweetheart, please. It's just paperwork. Your father's trying to save the company. Mom. I said, my voice shaking. You've been saying that for 10 years. Every time you need a signature, every time you want me to fix something you broke. I'm done. Her lips tightened. Dad's chair screeched as he shoved it back. Done, he snapped. You live under my roof. You'll help your family. I'm not your investment, I said, barely more than a whisper. I'm your daughter. That's when he threw the napkin onto the table. Get out. The words hit me like a slap. Mom's voice followed colder than the air outside. If you walk out that door tonight, don't bother coming back. We're embarrassed enough as it is. I stood frozen for a moment, surrounded by twinkling lights, the smell of burnt turkey, and the faint sound of carolers outside. For years, I'd swallowed every insult, every guilt trip, because I wanted to keep the peace. But this time, something inside me cracked. I picked up my coat, the thin sweater that passed for one, and walked to the door. My father didn't move. My mother turned her face away, pretending to fix a napkin that didn't need fixing. The moment the door shut behind me, the sound of the lock turning felt like a verdict. Outside, the cold hit me like glass. Snowflakes clung to my hair and lashes. My breath came out in white bursts that dissolved into the dark. I stood there barefoot on the porch for a second, not sure where to go. Inside, the laughter from a neighbor's house carried across the street, families together while I stood there with nothing but my keys and a phone that was already flashing low battery. I walked down the steps and into the street. The snow came harder sharp against my skin. I pulled my sweater tighter around me, but it didn't help. Halfway down the block, I stopped under a street lamp, shaking so hard my teeth clicked. I reached into my pocket for my phone, but instead my fingers brushed something cold and metallic. The pocket watch, the one my grandfather Henry had given me when I was 6. I remembered that day. His garden smelled like fresh-cut grass and oil paint, and he'd pressed the watch into my tiny hands with a smile. Keep it safe, he'd said. One day when all the doors close, this might open one for you. I'd laughed back then, thinking it was just one of his riddles. But tonight, standing in the snow with nowhere to go, the words felt like a map drawn in the dark. I flipped the latch open. The second hand ticked faintly, stubbornly alive. On the inside of the lid, scratched so small I'd never noticed before, were 5 letters and 4 numbers. Vault 1927, Columbia Trust. My breath caught. Columbia Trust was a bank downtown. Granddad used to talk about it sometimes, always with a tone of quiet respect. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But the thought of sitting here until I froze to death felt worse than chasing a ghost. Snow began piling on the windshield of my old Toyota as I climbed in. I tried to start the engine. Nothing. Tried again. The key clicked uselessly. Come on, I whispered. Not tonight. The heater coughed once, then died completely. The street was empty. Even the wind had stopped. I pulled a small blanket from the back seat and wrapped it around my shoulders. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the watch. The ticking was the only sound steady and soft a heartbeat. in a world that suddenly felt hollow. I leaned my head back against the seat, staring at the blurred lights of the houses up the hill. People were celebrating Christmas, families opening presents, kids laughing, the smell of cinnamon and pine. And me. I was sitting in a dead car with a relic from a man who'd been gone 3 years. For a moment, I thought I saw movement at the end of the street, a car idling headlights low, but when I blinked, it was gone. My phone buzzed once, then shut off for good. The blanket didn't stop the cold creeping into my bones. I curled up tighter, holding the watch close to my chest, feeling the faint warmth from its brass shell. In the darkness, I whispered to no one. "I don't know what to do, Grandpa." The ticking didn't answer, but somehow it calmed me. My eyes grew heavy. Outside, the storm thickened, wind howling through the empty street. Somewhere deep under the snow and silence, a decision was already waiting for me. One that would change everything once the sun came up. I closed my eyes, and for the first time that night, I stopped shaking. The last thing I heard before sleep took me was the faint, stubborn rhythm of the watch counting down to morning. When I woke, the car was buried in a thin crust of snow. The windows fogged from my breath. My body felt stiff, like I'd turned into part of the seat. The air was cold enough to bite. I twisted the key in the ignition, and the engine groaned once before falling silent. A patrol car slowed beside me, tires crunching on ice. The officer rolled down his window. "Morning, ma'am. Car trouble." "Yeah," I croaked, my voice raw. "Battery's dead." He stepped out his boots, sinking into the snow. "Rough night to be parked out here." His tone was gentle but curious. I gave a thin smile. "You could say that." He hooked jumper cables between our cars and started his engine. "Where are you headed on Christmas morning?" I hesitated, watching the faint steam of my own breath. "Portland," I said finally. "Just need to get there." He raised an eyebrow. "That's a long drive in this weather. I don't really have anywhere else to go." The officer didn't press. When the car finally coughed to life, he offered a quick nod. "Be careful on I-5. They're saying another storm's rolling in tonight." I thanked him and drove off. The heater struggled, blowing cold air against my hands until they stung. For a while, I just drove in silence, the world outside washed in white. I stopped at a rest area past Tacoma, bought gas station coffee so bitter it made my eyes water, and listened to the radio warn winter storm advisory still in effect across the Pacific Northwest. By the time the skyline of Portland appeared, a gray outline under pale sun, it was almost noon. My hands were shaking when I pulled into the parking lot of Columbia Trust Bank. The lobby was nearly empty. A Christmas tree leaned in one corner, half decorated. 2 tellers chatted quietly behind the counter. The air smelled of coffee and floor polish. I hesitated at the entrance, brushing snow from my coat. For a moment, I thought about turning around, about pretending the engraving inside the watch was just some old engraving, but something in me refused to go back to nowhere. At the front desk, a young woman with glossy hair smiled politely. "Good morning. How can I help you?" I placed the pocket watch on the counter. "I need to ask about a safe deposit vault. Number 1927. It's from here, I think." She frowned, tilting the watch to read the inscription. "Vault 1927. "Yes," I said. "It belonged to my grandfather. Henry Callahan." Her smile faltered. She looked closer at the back of the watch, where the tiny Columbia Trust insignia was engraved in faded gold. Her face went pale. One moment, please." She picked up the phone and spoke quietly. "Helen, you might want to come down here. It's about an old legacy account." I tried not to fidget. My fingers were red from cold. One of the security guards, a man with a shaved head, walked a slow circuit near the exit, eyes lingering on me like I didn't belong there. A few minutes later, an older woman appeared from the hallway behind the counter. Tall, silver hair swept into a bun. Dark suit, calm authority. She moved like someone used to being obeyed. "I'm Helen Grant," she said, her voice smooth but cautious. "You asked about a vault." I nodded, pushing the watch toward her. It was my grandfather's. "I think he kept something here." She turned it in her hand, inspecting the face, the hinge, the engraving. "Where did you get this?" "He gave it to me when I was a kid." "Oh." Her eyes lifted, studying my face for a long moment. "Your grandfather's name again." "Henry Callahan." She froze. The watch slipped slightly in her grip before she caught it. "Could you wait just a moment?" "Miss Warren." "Emily Warren." Helen blinked slowly. "Please sit down. I'll be right back." I sat on the edge of one of the leather chairs, heart thudding. The lobby felt too bright, too silent. The guard paused by the doorway again, pretending to check something on his phone. 10 minutes passed. My stomach was a knot. Finally, Helen returned, accompanied by a man in a gray suit I hadn't seen before. Broad shoulders, careful eyes, a small badge clipped to his jacket that read, "Internal Security." Helen's tone had changed. It was softer now, almost formal. "Miss Warren, would you mind coming with us?" "There's something we need to confirm." I stood, confused, but curious. "Is there a problem?" "Not a problem," she said. "Just a matter of protocol." We walked through a side door into a hallway lined with marble tiles and security cameras. The air grew colder as we descended the stairs. My boots squeaked against the polished floor, echoing in the narrow space. At the end of the corridor, a heavy steel door loomed circular and old, its locking wheel bigger than my torso. A faint smell of metal and oil hung in the air. Helen tapped a code into the keypad, then placed her palm on a glass scanner. The wheel turned with a deep, grinding noise. The door cracked open, releasing a breath of air so cold it felt alive. Inside, the light was dim and sterile. Rows of small brass boxes lined the walls. Helen walked slowly toward the far end, her heels clicking in steady rhythm. The man in the gray suit followed behind us, silent. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Helen stopped at a large, dust-coated safe built into the wall. It wasn't like the others. This one was older, hand-forged, a relic from another century. She rested her hand on the metal surface. "This vault," she said quietly, "was registered in 1979 under a private trust. It hasn't been accessed in over a decade." She reached up and brushed away a layer of dust from the engraving. Under the grime letters emerged, curved, elegant script. "Callahan Estate." I stared at it, my breath catching. Helen turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, you need to see this." The man stepped forward, inserting a small key into the lock, then stepped back. Helen nodded to me. "It's yours to open if you wish." For a long second, I couldn't move. The cold from the steel seeped into my skin. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle. Whatever was inside that vault had waited decades in the dark. And somehow it had been waiting for me. I drew in a breath and pulled the door open. The metal door gave a low groan as it swung open, and a thin draft of air drifted out, cold and dry like it had been trapped for years. Inside, light reflected off the edges of a large steel box sitting alone on a waist-high shelf. Dust clung to every surface. My fingers trembled when I reached for it, brushing away a fine layer of gray. The lock was still sealed with an old lead tag stamped with the Columbia Trust insignia. Helen slipped on a pair of white gloves and took a small brass key from her pocket. "This was sealed 4 years ago," she said, her voice a hush in the vault. "The date matches your grandfather's death certificate." June 2019. She glanced at me. "Only the legal heir can authorize its opening." "If that's what you want, I'll proceed." I nodded, though my heart was beating too hard to speak. She slid the key in. The mechanism clicked 3 times before giving way, and the lid lifted with a metallic sigh. Inside were neat stacks of folders wrapped in brown twine, a red envelope, several smaller sealed packets, and a black leather portfolio embossed with a faint logo. Aerovantage Robotics. Helen drew in a slow breath. "I remember this name," she murmured. "A small aviation startup from the early 2000s. Your grandfather must have been one of the early investors." I leaned closer. The smell of paper and metal mixing with the cold air. Helen handed me the red envelope first. My name, Emily, was written in Henry's looping, careful handwriting. Seeing it hit me like a punch. I hadn't seen his writing since the sympathy cards, after his funeral, the ones Mom and Dad had hidden before I could read them. I tore it open carefully. The paper inside was thick, ivory edges, slightly yellowed. "My dear Emily," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you have been forced out of a place that never deserved you. I feared it might come to this. The people you love will mistake control for care, and when you stop serving their needs, they will cast you aside. You must not let that define your worth. Everything within this vault is yours. Not as revenge, but as freedom. I swallowed hard, the words blurring as tears welled in my eyes. He'd known. Somehow, years ago, he'd seen this night coming. The letter continued, each line trembling but deliberate. Inside you will find records of what I built, what I protected, and what I could never trust others to handle. Use them wisely, not to punish, but to begin again. By the time I reached the end, my hands were shaking. Helen waited quietly until I folded the letter back into the envelope. "There's also this," she said, lifting the AeroVantage portfolio. She opened it halfway, revealing stock certificates, signed transfer documents, and a stamped company seal. "Miss Warren. These are legitimate holdings. Substantial ones." "How substantial?" My voice cracked. Helen hesitated. "The documents show a controlling share in a subsidiary of AeroVantage Robotics, now absorbed by a tech conglomerate. If accurate, the value could be significant." She closed the folder, meeting my eyes. "But you'll need a lawyer to navigate this. Someone experienced in estate recovery." I could barely breathe. "Do you know anyone?" "Your grandfather did?" She took out another card from the bottom of the box, aged but legible. "Vivian Rhodes, Portland. She handled his estate filings. I would start there." I nodded, gripping the letter. The edges cut faintly into my skin. Helen pulled a clipboard from the counter and set it before me. "For now, sign this acknowledgement of temporary custody. It confirms you've received the items under review. Bring government ID when you return. We'll need to verify and reopen the account formally once Ms. Rhodes is present." I signed, my handwriting shaky. When it was done, Helen locked the rest of the documents back into the vault. "Miss Warren," she said softly, "whatever your grandfather left here, he wanted you to have it. But people tend to notice when old money surfaces. Be cautious." I managed a nod, though my throat was too tight to thank her. The elevator ride back up felt endless. The hum of the machinery was the only sound. Helen escorted me through the lobby, past the Christmas tree, and out to the front doors. The afternoon light had already started to fade. The sky was that heavy silver that meant more snow was coming. I stepped outside, clutching the envelope and the watch in one hand. Across the street, a gray SUV idled by the curb. Its windows were tinted, engine running. A man sat inside, face shadowed by the reflection of the traffic light. He didn't move. I told myself it was nothing. Coincidence. But when I took a few steps toward my car, the SUV's brake lights flared, then went dark again. My pulse jumped. I quickened my pace boots, sliding slightly on the slush. The cold hit harder now, slicing through my sweater. I reached my Toyota, fumbled with the keys, and slid inside. The engine started on the second try. For a long moment, I just sat there watching the SUV, through the rearview mirror. It hadn't moved. The man inside was still there, still watching. I turned the heater on full blast, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Part of me wanted to march over to demand why he was staring. But another part, the part that still remembered my father's voice, sharp with contempt, told me to stay quiet, to keep moving. The car behind me didn't follow when I pulled out onto the main road, but the unease stayed lodged in my chest all the way back to the freeway. As the city lights faded in the mirror, I glanced at the red envelope on the passenger seat. My name glowed faintly under the dashboard light, written in a hand that still felt alive. Somewhere inside that letter was more than a gift. It was a warning. By the time I crossed the bridge and the skyline of Portland disappeared behind me, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever waited at the other end of this trail my grandfather left me, I wasn't the only one following it. Vivian Rhodes's office sat 20 stories above downtown Portland, all glass and steel and silence. The receptionist, a woman in a navy blazer with hair too perfect to move, asked for my name before letting me in. The air smelled like coffee and printer toner. When the elevator doors opened, I saw her immediately. Vivian Rhodes. She stood by a wall of windows overlooking the river, crisp in a charcoal suit. Her hair pulled back in a sleek twist. Her posture screamed control. She turned when I stepped inside. "Emily Warren." She said, her tone level but knowing. "Your grandfather spoke of you once." I froze mid-step. "He did." Vivian nodded slightly. "I didn't think this day would actually come." She gestured for me to sit at a conference table large enough to host a trial. Papers were stacked neatly in front of her, labeled with color-coded tabs. She slid one folder across the table. This, she said, is a notarized copy of your grandfather's will executed in 2017. It was kept sealed until either his passing or your verified arrival. My hands trembled as I opened it. At the top, bold letters. Last will and testament of Henry Callahan. Vivian continued, her voice calm but heavy. He transferred all personal assets and holdings, valued at approximately $72 million, into your name. This includes real estate in 5 states, stock in AeroVantage Robotics, and several private trust accounts. I stared at the page. 72 million. The number didn't even feel real. Yes, Vivian said. All legitimate. AeroVantage was a small aviation robotics company he invested in decades ago. It merged with a defense contractor in 2018. The stock appreciated dramatically after the merger. My stomach tightened. My parents, they said he was broke, that he lived on Social Security. Vivian gave a humorless smile. Your parents, Thomas and Margaret Warren, were specifically disinherited. The document cites breach of family trust and moral integrity. Those words are rarely used lightly. I pressed a hand to my temple. The office felt too bright. Vivian pushed a cup of water toward me. Drink. You're pale. I obeyed, my throat dry. She folded her hands. There's more. The bank that manages the trust, Columbia Trust, is currently under federal review by the FDIC. It means every account connected to the estate is temporarily frozen until full verification. You'll need to establish legal identity and inheritance rights. That includes DNA confirmation matching your grandfather's medical records. So, nothing is accessible yet. Not until the review clears. She leaned back slightly, studying me with the kind of focus that made me feel stripped bare. But Emily, this isn't just paperwork. Once word gets out that this estate is active again, people may come after it. Be careful who you talk to. My pulse quickened. You think my parents will find out? If they haven't already, she said simply. They will soon. I rubbed my palms together, cold sweat slicking my skin. Then what do I do? First, we verify your claim. She handed me a consent form. I'll arrange the DNA test through the county lab. Second, I'll be your legal representative in all estate matters. Sign here, and I'll file the notice of inheritance rights. I signed, my signature wobbly. Vivian's voice softened just a fraction. Your grandfather was meticulous. He must have known this would be complicated. She gathered the documents, aligning them perfectly. Henry was a man who planned every move years ahead. That's why he trusted me. I wanted to ask what he'd said about me, but couldn't. The words stuck in my throat like a secret too fragile to touch. Vivian stood and walked me to the door. I'll contact you when the verification results arrive. Until then, keep those documents and the watch safe. And Emily, don't tell anyone what's in that letter. I nodded, tucking the envelope deeper into my bag. Downstairs, the lobby glass reflected the pale sky like a sheet of ice. Outside, traffic crawled through slush horns muted by the snow. I stepped out into the cold, my breath fogging immediately. The street smelled like wet asphalt and rain-soaked pine. I was halfway across the intersection when I noticed it again. Parked at the far curb near a row of newspaper boxes was the same gray SUV. My heartbeat skipped. It hadn't followed me into downtown. Had it been here waiting? I slowed, pretending to check my phone, and raised it just high enough to snap a photo of the license plate. The engine of the SUV idled softly, exhaust curling into the air. The driver's silhouette was barely visible. Broad shoulders, a baseball cap. I sent the picture to Vivian with a short text. Think I'm being followed. She replied almost immediately. I'll report it to the police. Don't confront them. And Emily, don't travel alone at night. I pocketed my phone and kept walking, pretending not to notice the car, as I ducked into a nearby coffee shop. Inside, warmth hit me like a wall. I ordered a small black coffee and sat near the window, watching the SUV through the glass. 10 minutes passed. It didn't move. I tried to focus on the steam rising from my cup, but all I could think about was my grandfather's letter. Everything within this vault is yours. Not as revenge, but as freedom. Freedom. The word should have felt hopeful, but all I felt was the weight of eyes I couldn't see. By the time I left the cafe, the SUV was gone. I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. That night, I rented a small room at a rundown motel near Union Station. The walls smelled faintly of bleach and cigarettes, and the heater rattled like it was dying. I set the watch and the red envelope on the nightstand stared at them until the ticking felt too loud. The TV played low in the background. A local news anchor's voice broke through the static. In other headlines tonight, Columbia Trust Bank faces a new round of federal scrutiny over allegations of internal fraud and missing funds linked to legacy accounts dating back decades. The words made my blood run cold. I turned off the TV and sat in the dim light, the sound of the storm outside mixing with the faint tick of the watch. Maybe this was what Henry had meant when he said one day, when all the doors close. Because every door I'd known was gone, and the only one left was the one he'd left open for me. But even as that thought settled, a deeper one followed, sharper, darker. If I was walking through his door now, someone else was already standing on the other side, waiting. The next night I went to the small cafe near Union Station. It was the kind of place where nobody looked at anyone for too long, where the air smelled of burnt espresso and damp coats. I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a turkey sandwich and a small coffee, and sat near the back staring at nothing. The room blurred around me. My hands were shaking. I took one bite, but my stomach twisted. The noise faded into a low hum, and then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, a soft white light flickered above me. The smell of antiseptic filled the air. For a second, I thought I was back in my father's house, until a man's voice broke through the haze. "You're okay. Don't move too fast." A man in scrubs leaned over me, checking my pulse. His badge read Dr. Ethan Hale. He had calm eyes, the kind that made you want to believe everything was fine. What happened? My throat was dry. "You passed out," he said, adjusting the IV, attached to my arm. "Severe dehydration, low blood sugar. When was the last time you ate properly?" I tried to remember. "Yesterday, I think, maybe." He frowned. "You're lucky the cafe staff called it in. I was finishing my shift at St. Mary's when they brought you in." I blinked at the fluorescent ceiling, embarrassed. Great. Another thing for the Christmas miracle list. That earned a small smile from him. "You have a sense of humor." "That's good. Most people wake up in the ER angry. I'm too tired to be angry." He finished checking my vitals, then sat down on the chair beside my bed. "Do you have any family we can call?" I laughed quietly, though it came out more like a breath. No one who'd answer. He nodded. "Not pushing. Friends. Not really." My parents made sure of that. I wasn't sure why I said it out loud. Ethan studied me for a moment, not with pity, but with the kind of focus that made me feel seen. "All right," he said finally. "Then I'll keep an eye on you for a bit." The silence stretched. Machines beeped softly. I noticed the faint scar on his wrist, the way his sleeves were rolled just enough to show he'd been working too long. After a few minutes, he said, "You were clutching something when you came in. The nurse thought it was a keepsake." He held out a small evidence bag. Inside was my grandfather's pocket watch. I reached for it immediately. "That's mine." "I figured," he said, handing it over. "You wouldn't let go even when you were unconscious." The watch felt warm in my hands, like it had its own pulse. Ethan watched me turn it over. "It's beautiful. Must be old." "It was my grandfather's," I said. "He gave it to me when I was a kid." Something flickered in his expression. "Henry Callahan." My head jerked up. "You knew him." He exhaled slowly, nodding. "He was one of my patients. Heart condition. Smart man. Quiet, but sharp. He liked to talk about time. How he didn't want to waste what was left of it." I swallowed hard. "You treated him before he passed, yeah? And he gave me something the week before he died." Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small faded envelope. He said to keep it until someone came asking about a watch like his. The sight of the handwriting on the front, my grandfather's, made my breath catch. Ethan hesitated. He told me I'd know who it was for because the person would have that same watch and look like they'd run out of places to go. My throat tightened. "That sounds like him." He handed it to me gently. "I think he meant for you to have this." My fingers trembled as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. At the top, written in his neat hand, was another sequence of words and numbers. "Vault 1932, Oregon Safeco." I stared at it. Another vault. Ethan leaned back slightly. "Apparently so." "Do you know what it means?" I barely know what the first one meant, I said, half laughing, half choking on disbelief. He gave a small nod. When I last saw him, he said something strange. He told me one day the truth will start ticking again from the hands of that watch. I thought it was poetic nonsense at the time. My fingers traced the paper trying to make sense of it. Maybe it wasn't nonsense. Ethan met my gaze. Maybe not. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt charged with something I couldn't name. Then he said softly, "Whatever your grandfather was planning, he wanted you to find it." I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my bag beside the red envelope. I don't even know where to start. Then start small, he said. Find out what that address is. See where it leads. But don't go alone. I smiled faintly. Is that medical advice? It's common sense, he said. You look like someone who's already been through too much. He checked the IV line again, then stood. You're free to go once you've rested an hour. I'll write you a note for a clinic checkup. And Emily? I looked up. If you ever feel unsafe, or if that gray SUV shows up again, call the police. Or call me. He scribbled something on a hospital notepad and tore the page off, handing it to me. His handwriting was neat and confident. Dr. Ethan Hale, St. Mary's, personal line. Thank you, I said quietly. You didn't have to do all this. He shrugged a faint smile, tugging at the corner of his mouth. Everyone deserves one person in their corner. Tonight, that's me. He left the room, and I sat in silence, listening to the rhythm of the monitor beside me. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second echoing louder than the last. Later, after the discharge paperwork and the walk through the quiet hospital corridor, Ethan insisted on driving me back to my motel. Rain had started again, thin and cold, tapping against the windshield. He parked outside the narrow alley beside the building, engine idling. You sure you'll be okay? I nodded, clutching the envelope and the watch. Yeah, I've survived worse. He smiled gently. I believe you. I stepped out, the chill hitting me instantly. Before closing the door, he said, Don't forget, if you see that car again, you call someone. Promise me. I promise. He waited until I was inside before driving off. In my room, the heater hummed weakly. I sat on the bed, pulled the watch from my pocket, and stared at it under the dim lamp. The second hand kept moving calm and certain. Somewhere deep in my chest, something began to match its rhythm. That night in a city that still didn't feel like mine, I realized I trusted a stranger more than the people who shared my blood. The morning after the hospital, Portland felt quieter, colder. The storm had passed, but the air still smelled like ice and exhaust. I walked into Vivian's office with a knot in my stomach, clutching the folder she'd given me the day before. She was already waiting, standing by the window, her phone pressed to her ear. When she hung up, her expression told me I wasn't going to like whatever came next. Sit, she said, sliding a stack of papers across the desk. I need to show you something. I dropped into the chair, and she pushed the first document toward me. A scan of an affidavit dated August 2015. The header read, Columbia Trust. Internal review of the Callahan account. My father's signature sat at the bottom of the page. Vivian tapped it. Your father filed this with the bank 8 years ago, claiming that Henry Callahan was no longer of sound mind, that he needed assistance managing his financial affairs. My stomach dropped. He said my grandfather was incompetent. Yes, that's the word he used. Vivian flipped to the next page. This is the letter he attached recommending himself and your mother as joint conservators of the estate. I couldn't speak. Vivian's tone softened just slightly. Your father's company, Warren Construction, was drowning in debt back then. Millions owed to lenders. He needed a lifeline, and your grandfather's estate was the perfect one. I rubbed my temples, feeling the heat rise in my face. He tried to steal from him. He tried to take control. Vivian corrected. But Henry was sharper than they thought. He hired an independent evaluator to prove his competency and warned the bank not to grant them power of attorney. It's all here. She turned to another document. Henry's handwritten note to Columbia Trust dated 2 weeks after my father's filing. Do not authorize any financial transfers or amendments requested by Thomas or Margaret Warren, it said. I believe their motives are not in my interest. Vivian sighed. He tried to protect himself. But once he passed, those same claims, about him being unstable, became the reason the bank froze his assets. I leaned back, my breath shallow. And now they're using that same lie against me. Yes, she said quietly. They've done it before, and they know how to play the system. For a while, the only sound was the hum of the city through the glass. Then Vivian's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Speaking of systems, someone just reached out to me for you. She turned the phone so I could see an email notification. The sender's name was Caleb Price, Northwest Financial Journal. Vivian clicked open the message. Ms. Rhodes. I'm investigating irregularities in Columbia Trust's data archives. There's evidence suggesting internal information was sold to third parties. Some of it ties back to a Thomas Warren. I'd like to speak with his daughter Emily. Vivian looked up. Do you want to talk to him? I hesitated. A journalist investigative, she said. And he attached a file. She downloaded the PDF and spun the laptop toward me. My name and my father's appeared in black print on an official-looking document. Data Brokerage Contract 2021. Beneath that, the words Chicago Metrics Consulting glared like a wound. Your father sold client data from Columbia Trust, Vivian said. Millions of dollars worth. That's federal crime territory. My hands trembled as I scrolled. His signature was right there. Clean. Confident. How? How did he even get access, I whispered. Looks like through a contact inside the bank, she said. Caleb wants to meet. I think we should hear him out. I closed the laptop. My chest felt tight. Every time I think I know the worst about them, there's more. Vivian's eyes softened. That's what happens when people build their lives on lies. There's always more. The rest of the day blurred. I left the office with a copy of the affidavit and Henry's old letter. Outside, the clouds hung low, heavy with rain. The streets gleamed wet and gray. I walked until my legs ached, until the numbness spread from my hands to my chest. By the time I reached the motel, dusk had settled. The neon sign out front flickered weakly. I microwaved a cup of soup, but it tasted like paper. I tried reading my grandfather's letter again, but the words wouldn't focus. The phone buzzed beside me. Unknown number. Stop digging. Don't open the second vault, or you'll end up like him. I froze, staring at the message until the screen dimmed. Then I turned it off completely. I tried to convince myself it was just a sick prank, someone trolling the story that leaked from the bank, but deep down I knew better. I moved to the window, pushing the curtain aside just enough to look down at the street. There it was again. The gray SUV parked across from the lot under a broken streetlight. Its engine was off, but I could see the faint red glow of a cigarette through the windshield. My pulse hammered in my ears. I backed away from this window and sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the pocket watch in my hand. Its ticking filled the room. I tried to steady my breathing, but it came in short, uneven bursts. That's when my phone rang again. Vivian's voice came through tight and urgent. Emily, listen to me. Your father just filed an emergency petition in court. He's asking for a competency hearing to question your mental state. What they're claiming, you're emotionally unstable and unfit to manage financial matters. It's a standard tactic to regain control of the estate. I pressed a hand to my forehead. They're not even pretending anymore. No, she said. And they won't stop. But we'll fight this. I'll file an immediate objection first thing in the morning. My voice broke. They're going to destroy me. Vivian paused, her tone softening. No, they're going to try. There's a difference. When the call ended, I sat there in the dark, the hum of the heater filling the silence. I looked at the watch again, its hands frozen between seconds reflecting the yellow light of the lamp. The truth about my family was no longer just ugly. It was dangerous. I knew then that what Henry had left behind wasn't just an inheritance. It was a trail through every secret they'd buried, and I was standing right at the edge of it. And the people who'd buried it were starting to dig it back up. The courthouse smelled like wet wool and coffee. Cameras flashed as I stepped out of the car, the winter wind slicing through my coat. Headlines scrolled across a local news van parked at the curb. Heiress of late-tech investor faces mental health hearing. My name was spelled wrong on the ticker, but the implication wasn't. Vivian walked beside me, composed as ever, papers tucked under one arm. Keep your head up, she murmured. They're hoping to rattle you before we even walk in. I'm already rattled, I whispered back. She smiled faintly. Then don't let them see it. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I expected. Rows of wooden benches, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. My parents were already seated at the plaintiff's table. My father's gray suit looked expensive, but strained against his shoulders. My mother clutched a tissue she didn't need, eyes downcast like she was playing a role. Next to them sat their lawyer, David Langford. He was every inch the caricature of control. Sharp suit hair slicked back, voice smooth as steel. He nodded to Vivian as we entered, the faintest smirk on his lips. When the judge entered the room, went silent. He looked weary, like someone who'd been dealing with family disputes for too many years. Langford stood first. Your Honor, we're here because my clients are deeply concerned for their daughter's well-being. Miss Warren has displayed erratic behavior, delusional beliefs, and a fixation on imagined conspiracies involving her late grandfather's estate. My stomach twisted. He continued, We're asking for a temporary conservatorship so her parents can ensure her safety and the proper management of her inheritance. Vivian rose slowly, the quiet before a storm. Your Honor. The only delusion here is the belief that greed can masquerade as love. We have medical and legal evidence proving that Henry Callahan was fully competent when he executed his will. Langford scoffed. A convenient opinion from a lawyer paid by the beneficiary. Vivian didn't flinch. Convenient, yes, also factual. She handed a folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. Included here is a video statement recorded by Mr. Callahan 2 months before his death. In it, he discusses his estate plans in clear, coherent detail. The judge put on his glasses and watched the short clip projected onto the wall. My grandfather's face appeared. Older, thinner, but unmistakably lucid. I leave my assets to my granddaughter Emily Warren, he said in his calm, measured tone, because she has shown me kindness when others have shown me only interest. The sound of his voice cracked something open inside me. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. When the video ended, the courtroom was silent. Langford adjusted his tie. Mr. Callahan was clearly frail. He could have been coached. Vivian shot him a look that could cut glass. Then perhaps you'd like to hear from a neutral witness, Dr. Ethan Hale. Ethan stood from the back row, clean-cut, steady, and somehow unshakably kind, even under fluorescent lights. He walked to the stand, was sworn in, and spoke with the calm authority of someone used to life or death decisions. I treated Henry Callahan for 2 years, he said. He was sharp, articulate, and fully aware of his financial decisions. He discussed every aspect of his estate with clarity. He was not confused. He was careful. Langford tried to interrupt. Doctor, isn't it possible his illness affected his mental stability? Ethan didn't blink. No, and I find it offensive you'd use his medical condition as a weapon. A few people in the gallery murmured. The judge cleared his throat. Enough. I've heard enough for today. He leaned forward, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The petition for temporary conservatorship is denied. Pending further review, this case will be suspended until the court has verified the authenticity of the bank records and the estate documents. Vivian nodded once. Thank you, Your Honor. Langford muttered something to my father, who was already glaring at me across the room. When the gavel fell, I could finally breathe. Outside the courtroom, reporters shouted questions, microphones shoved toward my face. Miss Warren, are you mentally fit to handle the inheritance? Do you believe your family is conspiring against you? Vivian blocked them with one arm, ushering me toward the side exit. But in the hallway, my father stepped directly into my path. His voice was low, deliberate. You're making a fool of yourself. You're dragging our name through the mud. I met his eyes for the first time in months. You did that yourself, Dad. You're my daughter, he said, anger trembling under the words. Don't forget who raised you. You raised me to be afraid of you, I said quietly, not to respect you. For a moment, the mask cracked. Then he stepped back, jaw clenched. My mother caught his arm, whispering something I couldn't hear. Vivian appeared beside me again. We're done here. Let's go. We pushed through the side doors into the icy air. The crowd outside was thinner now, only a few stragglers smoking by the curb. My pulse was still hammering when a man brushed past me, slipping something into my hand. Careful who you trust, he muttered before disappearing into the crowd. I looked down. A white envelope. No markings. In the car, I tore it open. Inside were photographs. Grainy black and white stills from a security camera. Me standing in the Columbia Trust lobby. Me holding the watch. Me walking out of the vault with Helen beside me. My skin went cold. Someone had been watching me from inside the bank. Vivian frowned as she glanced at the pictures. This isn't random. Someone's tracking you through the investigation. I stared at the photos, my reflection, trembling in the car window. For the first time, I wondered if I'd ever really been alone in any of this. When justice bends to whoever has the most power, the truth doesn't matter. It just gets buried under noise. That night, as we drove away from the courthouse, I realized my parents didn't want to prove I was unstable. They wanted to make me believe it. The sky over downtown Portland was the color of steel when Caleb Price showed up outside Vivian's office. He wore a raincoat that looked too thin for the weather, his blonde hair plastered to his forehead. "Emily Warren," he said, holding up a press badge. "We need to talk. I think I have something that belongs to you." Vivian appeared behind me, her expression cautious. "You're the journalist who emailed last week." He nodded, lowering his voice. "I have a contact inside the FDIC. Her name's Janet Moore. She's been auditing Columbia Trust's old accounts, yours included. She found something she can't officially hand over, but thinks you need to see." Vivian's brows knit together. "How do we know this isn't a setup?" Caleb's tone stayed steady. "Because she's risking her job just to get it to you." An hour later, we were driving through the rain. Caleb's car smelled faintly of coffee and old leather. The wipers dragged across the windshield, fighting to keep up. "Janet said she can't meet anywhere public," he explained. "She suggested the lower garage beneath the old Columbia Trust annex. Cameras down there are dead half the time." I stared out the window, the city lights smearing into streaks of gold. "Why me?" Caleb gave a small shrug. "Because your grandfather's name keeps showing up on documents that shouldn't exist." We reached the garage just after 9. The concrete walls dripped with condensation, and the sound of rain echoed through the ramps above. A single fluorescent light flickered over the far corner. Janet Moore stood there, her gray coat buttoned to her chin, her umbrella dripping. She looked older than I expected, maybe late 50s. The kind of woman who'd spent her life in offices that smelled like toner and dust. "You must be Emily," she said softly, eyes darting around. "I don't have much time." She reached into her bag, pulled out a small silver USB drive, and pressed it into my palm. Everything I could copy without triggering alerts. Internal communications meeting recordings, audit logs. If they find out I lose everything. Vivian's warning echoed in my head. "Once people know you're inheriting money, they'll do anything to stop you." "Why are you helping me?" I asked. Janet's eyes flicked toward the ramp where a car door slammed somewhere above us. "Because I worked for your grandfather, too. He was kind. He treated everyone the same, from executives to janitors." "You don't forget men like that." She turned to leave her voice trembling. "Be careful who you trust." We didn't speak until she was gone. The sound of her footsteps faded into the rain. Caleb exhaled. "Let's see what's on it." We sat in his car engine, off the glow from the laptop lighting our faces. I plugged in the drive. A single folder appeared. "Confidential, Callahan, audit." Caleb clicked play on the first file. The audio was faint, scratchy, like it had been recorded through a vent. A voice I knew too well filled the car. My father's, "If we frame it as emotional distress, it'll hold up. She's always been fragile." Then another voice. "Langford's. The public eats that up. Make her seem unstable. Get someone to leak that hospital report. She'll look like she's unraveling." A chair scraped. My father again. If she believes it herself, even better. No one listens to the crazy daughter of a dead man. I covered my mouth. The tears came fast, hot, uncontrollable. "They're not just trying to ruin me. They want to break me." Caleb said nothing, his jaw clenched. The recording ended with the faint click of a door closing, followed by silence. I sat there for a long moment, unable to breathe. Every word felt like a nail sealing a coffin around me. Vivian played the next clip. Shorter this time. "The same 2 men. If the vault's contents come out, Langford said we're finished. Make her look dangerous, unpredictable. The court will take the bait." Vivian's voice, when she finally spoke, was low and steady. "This is evidence of conspiracy and fraud. It's enough to reopen the case." I wiped my eyes, trying to steady my hands, and the vault. The one Ethan told me about. She hesitated. If they were this desperate to bury the first, I'd say the second one holds something even bigger. When I returned to the motel that night, the hallway lights flickered like dying fireflies. My keycard stuck twice before the lock clicked open. I pushed the door slowly, then froze. The room was a mess. The drawers yanked open, clothes, scattered papers from Vivian's folder torn and tossed across the bed. My suitcase lay flipped, its zipper ripped. Someone had been here. I heard a faint noise from the bathroom. A drip, maybe, or a shoe scuff. I turned toward the sound, heart pounding, and caught a glimpse of movement near the window. A shadow lunged past, and the glass exploded outward as a figure dove through it into the alley below. I stumbled back, adrenaline flooding my veins. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called Ethan. He answered on the first ring. "Emily. Someone broke into my room. They were here. They took things. Stay where you are. I'm on my way." By the time he arrived, the police were already there. The officer, a young man with kind eyes, took my statement while another inspected the shattered window. "The camera in the hallway's been smashed," he said. "Looks deliberate." Ethan stood close, his presence steadying. "She needs protection. This isn't random vandalism." When the officers left, Vivian called. "We pulled footage from a nearby store's security camera," she said. "You're not going to like this." A few minutes later, she texted a still frame. It showed the side profile of a man in a leather jacket leaving the alley, his face half turned toward the lens. I recognized him instantly. Paul Ramirez, my father's former private investigator. The next morning, Vivian confirmed it. The police picked him up. He confessed. Said Thomas hired him to remind you to stay quiet. They claimed it was only intimidation, not harm. I laughed bitterly. That's supposed to make me feel better. But the fear had shifted. It wasn't paralyzing anymore. It was fuel. Caleb called later that afternoon, his voice buzzing with restrained excitement. "Emily, we're publishing. The piece goes live at midnight. The truth behind the Warren legacy. We're naming names." "Are you sure?" I asked. "You'll be dragged into this." "I already am," he said simply. "The world needs to know what they've done." That night, I lay awake watching the headlines roll in on my phone. Billionaire's family accused of fraud and coercion. Private investigator confesses to intimidation scheme. Whistleblower exposes Columbia Trust. Cover-up. My phone vibrated nonstop. Messages from strangers, sympathy from people I'd never met. Somewhere in the chaos, a quiet realization took root. They had tried to silence me through fear, but fear, I realized, was proof that I was still alive, and still fighting. Outside, the rain fell harder, drumming against the window in a rhythm that almost sounded like a heartbeat. The watch on my nightstand ticked steadily, each sound reminding me that time, my grandfather's time, was still on my side. The fog was thick enough to taste when we crossed into Oregon. Vivian drove her hands steady on the wheel, even as the road narrowed into a stretch of cracked asphalt, surrounded by pine. Ethan sat beside her, reviewing the directions printed on the old envelope from Henry's file. Caleb and I were in the back seat, the hum of the tires, the only sound between us. According to the records, Vault 1932, Oregon's safe conduit, was registered under an inactive business name hidden beneath layers of defunct addresses and paper trails. But the coordinates pointed here, just outside a town called McMinnville, past the vineyards, and into the fog. Vivian slowed the car in front of an old warehouse with peeling paint and a rusted sign that barely read Oregon Safe Company. The windows were clouded from years of neglect, and the padlock on the gate looked older than I was. A man emerged from a nearby shack, a caretaker maybe in his 70s, wearing a heavy flannel coat. He eyed us cautiously before speaking. "You the folks asking about the old Callahan account?" Vivian showed him the authorization papers. "Yes, we believe Mr. Henry Callahan kept a private deposit here. We have the code and verification letter." He squinted, taking the paper. "Well, I'll be damned. Haven't heard that name in a long time. Follow me." Inside, the air smelled of oil and cold metal. Rows of old safety vaults lined the walls, their brass handles dulled by time. The caretaker shuffled through a ledger that looked ready to fall apart, tracing his finger down a page. "There it is, number 1932. Registered under Callahan Industries, closed in 2019, no retrieval record." He led us to the back of the warehouse, where a massive steel door sat embedded in the wall. Unlike the others, it was nearly twice the size, with a mechanical lock that looked like something from a museum. Vivian handed him the code Henry had written in his note. "Let's try this." The man hesitated only a moment before inserting the key into the rusted slot. It turned with a groan that echoed through the room. The bolts released one by one, metal grinding on metal, until the door creaked open. A cold draft swept past us, as the light from our flashlights cut through the darkness inside. The vault wasn't large, maybe 10 by 12 feet, but every surface gleamed faintly under a thin layer of dust. In the center sat a table covered by a gray tarp. I stepped closer, pulling it away. Beneath it sat a small film projector, an old one, with spools of tape still threaded through. And beside it, a lead-sealed box stamped with the Callahan crest. Ethan crouched to examine the projector. "It's plugged into a manual power switch," he said. "We can run it through this generator." The caretaker flipped a switch on the wall, and the projector buzzed to life with a whirring sound. Light flickered onto the opposite wall, and then... My breath caught. My grandfather appeared in the frame. He was older, thinner than in the photo I'd seen from his will video, but his eyes, sharp, steady knowing, met mine through the decades. "If you're watching this..." He began, his voice soft but unwavering. "Then you've already faced what I feared most, betrayal. And if you've made it here, Emily, it means you've found your courage." I felt my throat tighten. Ethan placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. Henry continued, "I knew Thomas and Margaret would try to take everything, not because they needed it, but because they couldn't stand to see someone else free of their control. They forged documents, pressured me to sign over my accounts, claimed I was confused. But confusion is something they never understood. I was never confused. I was waiting." He leaned forward slightly in the frame, the shadow of his glasses glinting. "Everything they tried to falsify. Their copies, their signatures, their transfers. I documented it all. The originals are in the box before you. You will find the true will, the stock certificates for AeroVantage Robotics, and notarized statements from the board confirming my intent." Vivian's breath caught beside me. "Good God," she whispered. Henry smiled faintly, almost wistfully. "Justice is slow, Emily. It limps, but it never stops walking. When it reaches them, don't let hate guide you. Let truth do the work. That's the legacy I meant for you." The tape clicked, and the light went out. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the generator dying down. Ethan walked over to the sealed box and carefully broke the lead clasp. Inside, layers of documents were wrapped in wax paper and tied with string. Vivian lifted the top folder with trembling hands. Her voice shook. "These are the originals. Look, signatures from AeroVantage's board of directors dated 2017. The corporate seals are intact. This proves everything. Caleb was already photographing the pages for evidence. If this gets verified by the court, the fraud charges against your father will stick. There's no way around it." I reached for the envelope marked Last Testament, H.C., and traced my grandfather's handwriting. My tears blurred the ink. "He trusted me," I whispered. "He really trusted me." Ethan's hand found mine warm and sure. "He didn't just trust you, Emily. He believed you'd finish what he couldn't." Vivian nodded, her voice steadying. "We'll take these directly to federal custody for verification. This could reopen the entire case against your parents." The caretaker watched quietly from the doorway, hat in hand. "He came here a few months before he passed," he said softly. "Said he was leaving something behind for family. He looked peaceful, like a man who'd already forgiven the world." I turned to look at the box again, the faint smell of metal and time filling my nose. "He wasn't at peace," I murmured. "He was preparing." By the time we loaded everything into the car, the fog had thickened again, curling over the road like smoke. The headlights barely cut through it as Vivian drove back toward the highway. Halfway through the drive, my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in weeks. "Mom," I hesitated before answering. Her voice came through thin and tired. "Emily, please, if you have any mercy left, stop this. You're tearing this family apart." I stared out at the rain streaking the window. "You already did that when you lied about him." "You don't understand," she said quickly. "He was sick. He didn't know what he was doing. I felt something harden inside me. He knew exactly what he was doing. He trusted me because you gave him every reason not to trust you." "Emily." I hung up. The car was silent except for the rain. Vivian didn't speak. Ethan reached over and squeezed my hand once before letting go. For the first time, I didn't feel like the girl they'd thrown out on Christmas Eve. I wasn't the weak one, the dependent one, the scared one. I was the heir my grandfather believed in, the one meant to set things right. And as the fog swallowed the road ahead, I realized something else. The truth might have finally caught up. But the fight was far from over. The courthouse was overflowing. The marble steps outside were lined with reporters, cameras flashing as soon as Vivian and I stepped from the car. The winter air bit into my skin, but adrenaline kept me warm. Someone shouted my name from the crowd, another yelled heiress trial, before security pushed them back. Inside, the noise dimmed to a low hum. The courtroom was packed wall to wall, journalists, attorneys, even curious strangers who'd followed the story online. The headline on a newsfeed the night before had read, "Warren Family Scandal. Inheritance Trial Reaches Breaking Point." I stood behind the defendant's table, my palms slick. Vivian set her files down in perfect order, calm as always. Across from us sat my parents, their lawyer Langford between them. My father's jaw was tight, his knuckles white against the table. My mother wouldn't look at me. Ethan and Caleb sat quietly behind me in the witness section. When I turned, Ethan gave a small nod, steady grounding. The bailiff called for silence as Judge Turner entered. He was older, gray-haired, and carried the kind of presence that silenced a room without effort. "Court is now in session," he said. Langford rose first, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, my clients, Thomas and Margaret Warren, are here to contest the legitimacy of the so-called Callahan recordings and documents. We contend they were fabricated as part of a deliberate scheme by Ms. Warren and her counsel to seize control of her late grandfather's estate." Vivian didn't move, didn't even blink. When he sat, she rose slowly, smoothing the lapel of her blazer. "Your Honor," she began, "we intend to show that every document and video before you is original and authenticated by Columbia Trust's internal audit and FDIC verification. Furthermore, we will demonstrate that the plaintiffs, Thomas and Margaret Warren, conspired to defraud both the bank and this court through coercion, falsification, and intimidation." A murmur rippled through the room. Judge Turner's gavel came down once. "Proceed." Vivian turned toward the projection screen set up behind the witness stand. "Let's start with the video file recovered from Vault 1932 in Oregon." The lights dimmed. The screen flickered to life. My grandfather's face appeared, tired, aged but composed. "If you're watching this," he said, his voice clear through the speakers, "then you've already seen the lies unfold. I leave my estate to my granddaughter, Emily Warren, because she carries what I hoped would survive in this family, decency. The rest, I leave to the law." The room went completely silent. I could hear the soft clicking of cameras from the press row, then nothing at all. When the video ended, Vivian stepped forward again. "Your Honor, this recording was authenticated by 3 independent forensic labs. Its metadata and timestamps match Columbia Trust's archived security footage." Langford stood abruptly. "Objection. The technology used could easily have been replicated or tampered with by anyone with the right software." Judge Turner looked at him over his glasses. "Mr. Langford, unless you have evidence to suggest this recording was falsified, sit down." Langford hesitated, then sank back into his seat. Vivian pressed on. "We also have testimony from Dr. Ethan Hale, who treated Mr. Callahan until his passing. He can confirm the man's cognitive stability." Ethan took the stand, hand raised for the oath. "Henry Callahan was mentally sharp, Your Honor. I saw him weekly. He was clear, articulate, and deliberate in every conversation. He spoke often about protecting his granddaughter from manipulation." Langford crossed his legs and muttered something under his breath. Vivian's voice carried through the room. "And manipulation, Your Honor, is exactly what happened. Exhibit C. Bank transfers made 1 week before Mr. Callahan's death." She handed a packet to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. Turner flipped through the pages, frowning. "These are signed authorizations transferring funds from Mr. Callahan's estate to a private account under the name David Langford." The courtroom gasped. Langford's face drained of color. That's not possible. Those are falsified." "Really," Vivian said smoothly. "Because the transaction logs come directly from Columbia Trust's audit trail verified by federal investigators. Would you like to explain how your signature appears on wire transfers from a deceased client's account?" Langford's jaw opened and closed, but no sound came out. My father's hand shot out to grab his arm, his voice rising. "I told you to fix this, Mr. Warren," the judge snapped. "Sit down, or you'll be held in contempt." My father stood, shaking with anger. "You don't understand. That money was mine. He stole it from me first. I only took back what was rightfully ours." Vivian's expression didn't change. "And by ours, you mean yours alone." "Correct." Judge Turner's voice cut through the noise. "Enough. This court has heard sufficient testimony." He leaned forward, his tone like a blade. "The evidence presented today confirms that Mr. and Mrs. Warren engaged in deliberate fraud, including the submission of false statements and unauthorized financial transactions. The petition contesting the estate is denied." The room erupted in whispers. Furthermore, Turner continued, "The court recognizes Ms. Emily Warren as the sole and lawful heir to the Callahan estate. The allegations of mental instability are unfounded and dismissed with prejudice. I felt my breath catch. My legs almost gave out. Vivian's hand found my shoulder, steadying me. Judge Turner wasn't finished. Due to the seriousness of the evidence, this court will refer all related matters, fraud, intimidation, and potential witness tampering, to the state's attorney for criminal investigation. My father's face twisted with fury, but he said nothing. My mother's tears finally came streaking her makeup as flashbulbs from the press flickered like lightning across the room. When the gavel came down, it sounded final, echoing through the chamber like thunder. Outside, the air was a blur of voices and camera flashes. Reporters swarmed, their microphones shoved toward me. Miss Warren, how does it feel to win? After everything you've been through? I looked past the crowd, past the frenzy, toward the gray sky breaking open above the courthouse. No one wins, I said quietly. Not when a family falls apart. I didn't win anything. I just took back the truth. They kept shouting, but I didn't answer. Vivian ushered me toward the car, where Ethan and Caleb were waiting. As we drove away, the courthouse faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the steady hum of the road, and the quiet sound of my grandfather's watch ticking in my pocket. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and for the first time its voice was clear. By October, the leaves around Portland had turned the color of rust and honey. Every morning smelled like rain and pine, and the air carried a kind of quiet that felt earned. News headlines filled the background noise of my days, but they no longer sent my pulse racing. Warren Construction declares bankruptcy. Amid money laundering probe. I didn't even click the article. The truth had finally caught up, and for once, I didn't need to watch it happen. Thomas had lost every major contract. The board had dissolved what remained of his company. Photos of him leaving the courthouse made their way online. Shoulders hunched, tie loosened the look of a man realizing the empire he built on lies couldn't stand on its own. Margaret's name appeared in smaller print. Socialite withdraws from Portland Charity League, following family scandal. I imagined her friends whispering behind manicured hands, the same people who once competed to host her dinners, now pretending not to know her at all. I thought it would feel satisfying, but it didn't. It just felt inevitable. Ethan and I had moved into a little cedar house at the edge of Forest Park 30 minutes from downtown. It wasn't big, but it was ours. The fireplace still smoked on cold mornings, and sometimes a deer would wander close enough to fog the kitchen window. I'd turned the spare room into a studio, a mix of sketches, fabric samples, and unfinished furniture scattered across the floor. The brass plaque above the door read Callahan Design. I spent most days covered in sawdust, listening to the sound of the river and the faint ticking of my grandfather's watch mounted above my workbench like a guardian. One afternoon, Caleb came by with a recorder and his usual easy grin. "You know this is the first time I've seen you without lawyers or chaos around," he said, stepping over a roll of canvas. "Progress," I said, laughing softly. "Coffee?" He accepted, settling into the chair opposite me. "My editor wants a follow-up piece," he said. "Not about the trial, about you, the person behind the headlines. Can I ask you something off record?" I nodded. "If you could say one thing to Henry Callahan right now, what would it be?" I looked toward the window where the light filtered through the trees in soft gold. "I'd tell him thank you," I said quietly, "for believing in me before I ever learned to believe in myself." Caleb smiled faintly. "That'll make a good closing line even if I can't print it." When he left, I stood outside watching his car disappear down the long dirt road. The silence after his engine faded felt heavier than usual, but it wasn't lonely. Later that week, Vivian came by with a bottle of champagne and a grin that looked 10 years younger. "It's official," she said, holding up a manila envelope. "The FBI has opened charges against Langford. Wire fraud, embezzlement, obstruction. The whole list." I blinked. "He's really going to prison?" "Barring a miracle." "Yes," she said. "And as for your parents, the state's attorney's office is finalizing restitution terms. It's over, Emily. You can breathe." We toasted in the kitchen, the fire crackling behind us. Vivian laughed as the cork ricocheted off the ceiling. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked almost light. "Do you ever miss it?" I asked after a while. "The fight." She tilted her glass thoughtfully. "Sometimes, but winning isn't the same as peace. You've earned the second one. Don't go looking for the first again." That night after she left, the house felt still. Ethan was reading in the living room, the glow of the lamp soft against his face. When I looked at him, I thought of how far we'd come from that night in the hospital when I'd fainted in a diner booth, and he'd caught me before I hit the floor. My phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. For a moment, I almost didn't answer. But something, maybe instinct, made me swipe to accept. Emily. A familiar voice said quietly. It was Michael, my brother. He hadn't called since the day of the trial. I just wanted you to know, he began. Dad sent a letter through his lawyer. A formal apology. He's not the same. And Mom's in a treatment program. They both asked if you could forgive them. I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes. Forgiveness isn't something you can demand through a lawyer. I know, he said quickly. They just wanted you to hear it. Dad said he doesn't expect anything, just wanted to say he was sorry. The silence stretched. Finally, I said softly, Take care of them, Michael. They're still your parents. I can't fix what they broke, but I can wish them peace from afar. He hesitated, then whispered, You sound like him, like Grandpa. After the call ended, I went out to the porch. The night air was cold enough to make my breath fog. I could hear the faint hoot of an owl somewhere in the trees. Ethan joined me a moment later carrying something wrapped in tissue paper. What's this? I asked. He smiled. Something I made for your studio. Open it. Inside was a simple wooden frame sanded smooth holding the photograph of Henry and me from years ago, the one I thought I'd lost when my parents threw me out. Etched into the metal plate below was a small engraving. When the hands stop, the wish has come true. The watch in the photo had its time frozen at 11:11. I felt my throat tighten. It's perfect. He slipped an arm around my shoulders. Then it's yours. Consider it a reminder that not every ending has to hurt. We stood there for a long time, the sound of rain soft against the roof. I thought of all the ways karma could have struck, loud, destructive, punishing, but it hadn't. It had come quietly like the hush after a storm, when the world feels clean again. Karma doesn't always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it comes as peace, the kind that settles when you finally stop wanting revenge and start remembering how to live. Spring came early to Oregon that year. By April, the rain had softened. The sky had turned a shade of blue so clear it looked almost painted, and the hills outside Portland were dotted with wildflowers. I drove with the windows cracked just enough to let the scent of pine and new grass in. In the passenger seat, a bundle of white tulips rested beside the watch that had once started it all. The cemetery sat on a hill outside town, quiet and unassuming. Rows of simple headstones curved along the slope, surrounded by dogwoods in bloom. I parked under an old oak tree and walked up the narrow gravel path, the sound of my shoes crunching beneath me, mixing with birdsong. Henry Callahan's name was etched in clean, simple letters on a gray marble stone. There were still fresh flowers there. Someone else must have come recently. But I laid my tulips beside them anyway. The breeze tugged at the ribbon around the stems. I sat on the grass, pulling the watch from my coat pocket. The metal had warmed in my hand by the time I clicked it open. The hands pointed exactly to 11:11. Hey, Grandpa, I said softly. I kept my promise. For a moment, everything stilled. The air, the leaves, even the sound of traffic from the road below. I told him about the little house near the woods, about the studio, and the smell of sawdust in the mornings. I told him about Ethan, how he never walked away when things got hard, and about Vivian, who'd become more like family than the one I was born into. I even told him about my parents, not with bitterness, but with the kind of honesty that doesn't hurt anymore. I forgave them, I whispered, not because they deserve it, but because I needed to. The wind stirred through the trees like a quiet acknowledgement. I closed the watch gently and set it on top of the headstone for a moment, letting the sunlight catch its glass face. It reflected against the stone bright enough to make me squint. When I picked it back up, the second hand had started moving again. Ethan waited at the bottom of the hill, leaning against the cars with 2 cups of coffee. When he saw me, he smiled the way he always did, like there was no rush in the world. You ready to go home? He asked. Yeah, I said, slipping the watch back into my pocket. Home sounds perfect. We drove with the windows down, the wind carrying the scent of wet earth and cedar through the car. The road curved through the countryside sunlight, flashing between trees, each mile pulling me farther from everything I used to fear. I watched the sky reflected in the windshield and realized it had the same color as freedom. When we reached the house, the afternoon light poured through the tall windows, spilling across the floor like gold. I set my bag down, walked to the wall of my studio, and hung the photo frame Ethan had given me, the one engraved with the stopped hands of the watch. Beneath it, I placed my first design draft for Callahan Design, a simple oak table with curved edges, the kind my grandfather would have run his hands across just to feel the grain. I traced the drawing with my fingertips and felt something shift inside me, like closure, but quieter. Ethan appeared in the doorway. "You look like someone who finally exhaled." "I think I did," I said, smiling. For the first time in a long time. He stepped closer, slipping his arm around my waist. "Then let's keep it that way." Outside, the sky was streaked with soft light. A breeze carried the smell of rain, the kind that comes only after a long season of storms. I thought of everything that had happened, the courtroom, the betrayal, the nights when I'd slept in my car, and none of it felt heavy anymore. It just felt distant, like another lifetime I'd finally outgrown. I stood by the window for a while, watching the tulips in the garden sway in the wind. Their petals opened toward the sun, pure and unguarded. Somewhere inside I understood that was the point, not to erase the pain, but to bloom anyway. Justice, I realized, doesn't always need applause. Sometimes it's as simple as living a life that's finally yours. And for me, that life was beginning now, with clean air, quiet mornings, and the courage to be kind even after everything. If you've ever been underestimated or silenced, remember this. The truth will find its way back to you, and so will grace. Because no matter how far you fall, kindness has a way of leading you home. Tell me your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found your strength